Good morning, everybody. So this is the lesson of Monday, the 8th of June, 2020, recorded in lockdown, ongoing, and it's the second of three linked lessons, which kind of falls under that umbrella heading, how extensive was the support for Hitler and Nazism, 1933 to 1945, and as said in the first of those lessons, very much using essay 1 from the Stephen J. Lee chapter for the notes for this. Okay, so this lesson is about Hitler's popularity and the nature of support for the Nazi regime. So as I say, it's the second of three lessons, and that slide reminds you what the three lessons are. So our last lesson was about the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. So what we're doing here is looking at Hitler's personal popularity and the nature of support for the Nazi regime. And then next lesson, we will look at the attitudes of different sectors of the population towards the Nazi regime. Working classes, middle classes, women, young people, etc., religious groups as well. Okay, so as I said, very much using this essay, essay 1, how extensive was support for Hitler and Nazism. So it's really important that you read the whole of that essay carefully. Chapter 6, how extensive was support for Hitler and Nazism. And my notes are based on that particular essay. It's not to say as well that you shouldn't be reading the second one, which kind of like is the flip side of it. It's like looking at the negative thoughts towards the regime, in particular opposition and resistance. So that's all part of popular opinion as well, so make sure you read that. And then I emphasised this in the last lesson. Put that slide back in because it is so important. A really outstanding chapter in Noakes and Pridham called The Regime and the People. And you've got my own detailed notes. Read the chapter, it's only a short chapter. Then read my detailed notes, or read it alongside the chapter. And also you've got a YouTube commentary, which is 32 minutes, in which I walk and talk you through my notes to that chapter, and you can access the YouTube video there, but also if you go to the playlist called Germany 1933 to 39, you'll see the video in there as well. So here's the mind map. Now this is the mind map for this lesson and the third lesson, the next lesson, which will be the third of the three. And today's lesson we will focus in on Hitler's popularity, the reasons for Hitler's popularity, and the sort of notion of negative support. Okay, and then our next lesson, which will finish this off, will cover those 5 remaining strands, which, as you can see, look at the individual sectors of society and how they felt about the Nazi regime. So, the usual process. Have the mind map in front of you. Make sure you stuck it into the middle of an A3 sheet and map the key points onto the mind map. So our first strand is Hitler's popularity. Okay, so the usual, in a nutshell, a summary. It's just a very simple one-sentence summary here. Hitler's personal popularity was a key reason why most Germans, irrelevant of social class, irrelevant of age, irrelevant of religious persuasion, most Germans at some point or another consented to the Nazi regime, across, and especially across class divides. It was a unifying factor, whether you were working class or middle class or upper class. Most Germans of all social classes at some point or another found Hitler's personality appealing. Okay. So Hitler's personal popularity is something that you just need to be able to articulate if you're talking about popular opinion in Germany between 1933 and 1945. So there's only one slide with the details. Okay, just have a quick look at that. Hitler's popularity was the main reason for positive support. Okay, positive support, in other words, consent. Okay, try to use that word consent. The fact that Hitler's power and the power of the Nazi regime in general, remember, it's very easy to get such into that way of thinking, that the Germans followed Hitler because they were afraid of Hitler and the regime. Put that to one side. At some point or other, most Germans, and in particular in the early 1930s, say 1933 to about 1936-37, were attracted to the Nazi, attracted to Hitler's message and to Hitler himself, and believed that he was doing some good for Germany. But it was obviously a complex picture. Okay, so it is important to sort of recognise, as that picture shows, the sort of cheering crowds, etc. Okay, so these are sort of like ideas that we've already developed in previous lessons, but again, just to help you articulate them in an essay. So Hitler was seen as a heroic leader. That's what the Führer cult was about. Okay, so many Germans saw Hitler to be a direct successor to the sort of populist vision that goes back to the Second Reich, Germany 1871 to 1918, and the Kaiser Wilhelm I and Wilhelm II as a heroic leader. In fact, more so, also, I would say Bismarck as well. Okay, often Goebbels in his propaganda sort of like made that direct connection in the sense that Hitler was the new Bismarck. Okay, so tapping in to the popularity that Bismarck had as the great chancellor, the great statesman who created Germany in 1871. That Hitler, his personal trait, his abilities, directly continued from the Second Reich. Okay, so Hitler therefore filled a gap, because during the Weimar Republic there had been no equivalent heroic figure. So the Weimar Republic, because during those 14 years from 1918 to 1932, 1919 to 1932, a new constitution had been created, which was a democratic constitution, which had admitted ordinary people into politics. That's what democracy does. It admits the masses into the decision-making process. Of course, we see that as being fair and important. Everybody has an equal vote, and governments are accountable to the parliament, which is the elected representatives of the people. But of course, the Nazi view, and to a large extent the view of the Second Reich, was that democracy stifled heroic figures. Okay, that if strong leaders with strong with heroic leadership qualities had to constantly give account to ordinary people, in other words, the Reichstag, which represented the millions of ordinary people, then these leaders were stifled, they were constrained, they couldn't actually shine. So there's that sort of idea that what Hitler has done is he's stepped in, he's now the equivalent heroic figure of the type of heroes that were able to blossom in the Second Reich, and hence Hitler's Germany was called the Third Reich, and the intervening years the Weimar Republic was wiped out. The next one, the chameleon nature of Hitler. Now, of course, a chameleon is a lizard that changes its skin, its texture, its skin colours to disguise itself against its background. So the analogy here, which Kershaw very much demonstrated in his book The Hitler Myth, and remember we did a whole lesson about the Hitler Myth a few weeks ago, was that Hitler was able to offer something to people of every class. Okay? That, remember, the Nazi ideology was deliberately very vague in terms of its precise promises. It didn't want to get trapped into specific promises to the working classes, because if you make specific promises to the working classes, it would upset the middle classes, and vice versa. Okay? So the best thing was to avoid specific promises. If you're going to appeal to all Germans of all social classes, you've got to make promises that appeal to something higher than that. And of course, that is the nation, because whether you're working class or middle class, you're all Germans. So Hitler was seen as the representative of the national interest. Okay, that the whole propaganda image of Hitler was that he was putting his own personal happiness first. He was putting the nation first, and that he did not represent any particular social class. He was not unlike other politicians. The leader of the SPD is the representative of the working classes. The leaders of the German Nationalist Party is the representative of the middle classes, etc. Okay, that's particularism. Okay, where a party represents a particular class. Hitler was able very effectively to put himself forward as being the representative of all Germans and acting completely selflessly for the good of the nation. The propaganda image was of a humble, simple man. And indeed, Hitler was teetotal, for example. He didn't indulge in alcohol, and he was always projected in propaganda images as having very simple pursuits, taking the dog for a walk in the mountains, etc., etc. That's the image that he had, untainted by the normal distractions that other politicians can get themselves into, the distractions of power and wealth, etc. Okay, so it was a very effective personal appeal. Okay, so that's our first strand, the personal popularity of Hitler. Now let's develop that a little bit further and look at the reasons for Hitler's popularity. Okay, so Hitler's popularity with most Germans was caused by three factors, and the first one I just touched upon there. He was seen to be a moderate. Okay, in comparison to the Nazi Party itself. Okay, his simple lifestyle was very appealing. That's the second one to German people. So firstly, he was a moderate, and secondly, his simple lifestyle, and thirdly, he delivered. Okay, he was a man of action, not speech, not speaking, and in particular, he delivered in terms of the economy, creating jobs, and in terms of dismantling the Treaty of Versailles without going to war. Okay, so let's just unpick those three. Again, I think in the exam, that's useful, 3 pegs to remember, and then you can, if you just remember those 3 points, you should be fine. Okay, so let's take each of those. So that first one, the main reason for Hitler's popularity, he was seen as a moderate. Now, of course, we as historians, our perception of Hitler is, in a sense, not that he was a moderate, because we know him for what he really was. We know because we know what eventually happened. We see him as an extremist, which he was undoubtedly, a radical who ultimately took Europe and the world into a devastating world war, and who was uncompromising in his ambition for living space, and of course the Holocaust and the mass extermination of ethnic populations, especially the Jews. But at the time, and in particular in the first 5 years, 1933 to say 1937, that sort of period, Hitler was actually seen firstly by German people, but also to a large extent by other countries like the British, as a reasonable politician who was actually a moderate. Okay, in many ways. So this was all part of the guise that Hitler presented. He was a wolf who dressed himself up in lamb's clothing, effectively. So think about what you already know. Okay, so those hugely important political changes that we've talked about, the Reichstag fire decree that gave Hitler the power to suspend civil liberties and take over the policing, the Enabling Act, which gave him the power to pass laws by himself, and all of those measures of Gleichschaltung, the crushing of the trade unions, the creation of a one-party state, and the removal of the rights of the federal states. Now, we know, of course, as historians, we can see that that was delivered by a huge amount of political violence and extremism. Okay, but at the time, Hitler made sure that those changes were seen to be legal and constitutional. Everything was backed up by a law. Okay, and Hitler was at great pains to sort of like put across the fact that he was a respecter of law and order. Now we know he wasn't. He had no respect for law and order. Ultimately, he was ultimately a gangster who destroyed Germany, took the world into World War. But he was seen to be, in that sense, a respecter of moderate values. Development on that. Hitler constantly emphasized that he was upholding traditional values. Okay, look at his speeches, and he would constantly profess to be deeply religious. Yeah, his opening address, his first speech, very famous speech, I mentioned it in the lesson when we did about the national uprising. His first speech was called the Appeal to the German People. It was delivered on the 1st of February 1933. First big speech on the radio. He mentioned God 5 times in that speech. Now, there was nothing godly about Hitler at all. There's nothing Christian about Hitler at all. But Hitler's values were deeply unchristian. Survival of the fittest, etc., etc. There's nothing there in social Darwinist ideology about protecting and supporting the weak. Okay, so Hitler believed in the law of the jungle. There was no Christianity there in Hitler, but nevertheless he would often profess to be deeply religious. So the image he tried to put across was very different from what we actually know he was like. Okay, but the image that he put across at that time was taken in by millions of people, and that's not just in Germany, but by people around the world. Okay, another thing he would often talk about the traditional family structure, especially rural life. Again, think about how popular the Nazi Party were with farmers and rural communities from the villages. The big voters, the groups who in particular backed the Nazis in the elections before Hitler became Chancellor, were largely from the countryside because they were very attracted to those sorts of values. Hitler, would always speak about the Industrial Revolution had created these evil things, like the birth of communism had come out of the Industrial Revolution. And he promised that the Nazi Party would rebuild traditional family values. And that, of course, was a key message of the Volksgemeinschaft. Okay, we did that in the last lesson, the sort of simplicity of old family values, in which women shouldn't be going out to the workplace, women should be at home, and their role was a domestic role. And that was very, very appealing at the time to many, many women, because the Weimar Republic was seen to be a sort of social experiment that had gone too far and had unsettled, in particular, middle class values were very attracted by this idea of decency and back to the basics that the Nazis professed to put across. And then, of course, the other one, which we did a whole 2 lessons on, of course, was the Night of the Long Knives. And it's a classic example of how we as historians now have a completely different understanding of it from how it was understood at the time. We, of course, know that Hitler displayed his gangster colours there. I mean, he was the head of a government ordering murder. But it wasn't seen that way at the time. At the time, by the middle classes and by the army and the conservatives, Hitler was seen to be this leader who tamed the party radicals. He was taking action, nipping in the bud extremism, murdering the SA, because the SA threat was seen to be much more extreme. And Hitler, he had to use violence, but he was using violence to bring a halt to a second revolution. He was using violence so that the path of evolution, gradual change, could be restored. So he was perceived as a moderate. Okay. A SOPAID report. Now, the SOPAID were the SPD. Remember the old Social Democratic Party? That they all went into exile in 1933, those who didn't get put into concentration camps. Mainly they went to Prague in Czechoslovakia. But they maintained a network of working class informants who gathered information about what was the popular mood about amongst the ordinary German people, and at great risk themselves, because if they'd been caught doing this, they would have been arrested and put into concentration camps. And these working class Germans smuggled their reports out of Germany, and they were sent to Prague to the German SPD headquarters, and they were called SOPAID reports. They're compiled and they're very reliable pieces of evidence, because there's no the purpose of a SOPAID report was to get a genuine, honest assessment of what was the mood like in the German population. And they were very pessimistic about it. They're saying that, this is terrible. Basically, it appears that Hitler is not being criticised. That if there's any rumblings of discontent in Germany, certainly in the first 4 or 5 years of Hitler's regime, most Germans complained about the Nazi Party and about the SA and maybe about the SS, but Hitler almost seemed to be untouchable. People always made excuses for Hitler and said, "Oh, yeah, he's a good guy." Why is he a good guy? Because he showed us on the night of the Long Knives that he's prepared to step in and look after us. Okay, so there's that one. Okay, the second one. Another reason for Hitler's popularity was that he was seen to be detached from politics. And look at the picture there. Okay, that sort of idea of a simple man who is just an honest, decent German. Sort of like preferred to spend his time with his dog than get involved in politics. Okay, so remember, this goes back to the lesson about his leadership style. Distanced himself from the capital city, based himself in the countryside. He had these unusual working hours, almost like an old king from the Middle Ages, sort of standing above the day-to-day realities of the regime. A man who distanced himself from the details and had his eye firmly focused on the important points. Okay, didn't want to get involved in the sort of like petty squabbles and the details and the politics. A sort of positive symbol of values. Okay, the simple man who just simply was doing the right thing for the German people. And remember, we said how the Nazis rewrote the constitution basically and defined Hitler's voice as the law. And they said that this was valid because Hitler spoke for what the German people wanted. Hitler was the voice of good, honest Germans. And so when Hitler spoke, it carried the weight of law. So detachment from petty squabbles. And that, of course, all helped make him appear to be a unifying force. So that's the first two reasons. Then the third reasons was that he delivered results. Unlike the old politicians of the Weimar Republic who made lots of empty promises, they were men of big words but little action. The impression that the Germans had was Hitler as Chancellor was a man who actually delivered. Okay. Now, clearly, Goebbels and his propaganda machine, remember, Goebbels was the Nazi propaganda chief and he became Minister for Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda. But clearly, he played a huge part in delivering this message and convincing the German people about Hitler was the man who delivered. And again, the evidence from SOPAID reports is that it was key. Okay, in 1939, there was a SOPAID report that said, this is the real key to Hitler's popularity. He delivers. So again, in the exam, you just need to be able to articulate very concisely, what did he deliver on? Okay, so you've got a series of points here, A, B, and C. What did he actually deliver on? So first of all, he delivered on sorting out unemployment. Unemployment was 6 million when Hitler came to power in 1933. It had dropped to less than 1 million by 1936. So in that sort of 4-year period, with an economic upturn. And in the eyes of ordinary Germans, Hitler took much of the personal credit for that. Okay. Now, we as historians now know, writing sort of many, many years later and having had a chance to get perspective on this, we know that actually the economy would certainly almost have got better anyway, even if Hitler hadn't been the leader of Germany, because there was an international upturn. Okay, internationally the economy was improved. Remember, the Great Depression was not just German; it was an international, a worldwide Great Depression, and Hitler took power just at the point, January 1933, when that depression had bottomed out, and from that point on, across the world, the economy was steadily improving. So the Nazis and Hitler rode that tide, that they rode the wave of international economic recovery. It would have happened anyway. That's the first one. Secondly, foreign policy. Okay, now we now know, of course, that Hitler's huge foreign policy successes in the 1930s were ultimately motivated by the fact that Hitler was preparing for a big war so that he could launch a big attack in the east for living space. And of course that big attack happened in 1941 when Germany eventually invaded Russia. In other words, that the preparations of the 1930s were all about stepping stones to war. But it was not seen that way at that particular time. The ordinary German people genuinely felt Hitler did not want war, and that all Hitler wanted was to dismantle the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and to do that by talking over the conference table, a man of peace who was simply standing up to do what was right for Germany, who did not want to take the country to war and was determined to revise the Treaty of Versailles one stage at a time by talking to the Allies and persuading the Allies to give in. Now, of course, we know that Hitler backed up every single one of these stages by the threat of war. And Hitler was a huge gambler, and he was ultimately prepared to take that risk for war, particularly once we get to 1938, and particularly in the Sudetenland Crisis. I mean, almost with the Sudetenland Crisis, Hitler was actually disappointed in the sense that he didn't get the war that he wanted. There was a sense of hubris that took over his character by 1938. As sort of like he shifted. He genuinely, he was a crazed person who became beset on violent expansion of Germany's frontiers. But that's not how the German people saw Hitler. Okay, they saw, in terms of foreign policy, he managed to securely revise the Treaty of Versailles one bit at a time. So the Rhineland was remilitarized in 1936. The Anschluss, Austria, was annexed, and then the Sudetenland in October 1938, the Munich Agreement. And each of those stages, Hitler dismantled the terms of the Treaty of Versailles without war. Okay, all without war. And so there was a sense of awe of this great international statesman who was able to achieve so much for Germany on the international stage, and he was able to do it without taking the country to war. Now, of course, 1939, it all went wrong over Poland, and Hitler gambled one stage too far, and Germany did end up at war. Okay, and there's a lot of evidence at that point. There was almost like a war psychosis amongst ordinary Germans. They did not want the war that got, but by that particular point, it was too late. They had put this monster into power, and his power was so great over the people during World War II that they had, in a sense, missed the boat in terms of being able to speak out against him. But certainly, a lot of popularity. And then, thirdly, let's talk briefly about that. He did overstep the mark in September 1939. Okay, he focused in on the Polish corridor, and he tried the same thing. He tried to put pressure on the Allies. We want the Polish corridor back because it's populated by Germans. We want to have Germany's eastern frontiers redrawn. And by that point, the British had seen what Hitler was, and they were not prepared to accept his false promises anymore. Okay, they'd given in to him over the Sudetenland Crisis, but they were not prepared to accept it anymore. And of course, the gamble that Hitler took when he invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939 did not pay off, and Britain 2 days later declared war on Germany. So at that point, yes, Hitler's popularity dipped. But the thing is, within 2.5 weeks, Poland was crushed. Okay? And the British, who declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, did nothing. Okay? You've heard of the phony war. Okay? The British militarily, and I don't want to get into the history of the war, were not really ready for that to fight against Germany. And Hitler still continued in September and October of 1939 to sort of believe that he could proceed with his plans, his military plans, and persuade the British to pull out of this war. And so even in this beginning, the first 6 months of the war, Hitler was able to then present to the German people, look, you do not need to be anxious about this war. I'm going to win it. And of course, all the evidence suggested that Germany could win this war, because the first 2 years of World War II were fought with astonishing success. Poland was defeated in 1939, and then in 1940, Hitler invaded Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Norway. They're the countries whose sea borders effectively surrounded Britain, so that to put pressure on Britain to pull out of the war. Those countries were all defeated. It was not like World War One, where it got bogged down in trench warfare, because by this point the technology could overcome the problems of trenches. This is fast blitzkrieg attacks, as we call it, lightning attacks, because aeroplanes, dropping bombs were not a feature in World War One. Now they're sort of like the key first thrust of a military attack. And by the summer of 1940, when France was defeated, and remember, France had never been defeated in World War One, but France was defeated in a matter of weeks in an astonishing blitzkrieg attack. Hitler, either directly or indirectly, was in control of much of continental Europe, and Britain was alone. Remember, at this point, Russia wasn't in the war and America wasn't in the war. They didn't come into World War II until 1941. So by the summer of 1940, it really looked as if Hitler had won World War II. Okay, had won this war that he launched. And so that again was another reason, another boost to Hitler's popularity. Not only was he the guy who had single-handedly solved the unemployment problem created by the Great Depression of 1929 to 32. Not only was there the man who had single-handedly revised the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but now that Germany was at war, he was a great military leader. That's how his image appeared. Okay, and I say a lot of that was sort of put across by and talked about by Kershaw in his book The Hitler Myth, the different levels of Hitler's popularity. Lee, there's a quote from Lee there as well. So there we go. Those are the sort of like the specific reasons for Hitler's personal popularity. Put another knowledge retrieval test in here for you, so you can just pause the video. I won't go through the questions and the answers, but the answers are on the next slide. So it's the usual sort of approach for you. There are 3 questions from our last, or our most recent lessons, and then there are 3 questions from the last month, and then there are deeper questions that go back further. So remember, if you're going to succeed as an A-level historian in the final examination, it has to be fingertip knowledge. And fingertip knowledge basically is knowledge that has been put into your long-term memory. You can't prepare for A-level exams simply by last-minute cramming in the last couple of months before the exam. You've got to have it at your fingertips. So have a go, see how much of that you can actually remember. It's a test of your fingertip knowledge. Pause the video, and on the next page, which I'll go to now, you've got the answers. So there are the answers to those questions. Okay, and now the final strand of this lesson, the negative support issue. Okay, so we've talked about the popularity, and in particular how Hitler himself was sort of like at the crux of understanding why many Germans chose to support the regime and chose not to oppose the regime. Okay. And they remember that the perception, therefore, is very different from the way we see it now. We have the advantage of hindsight. It's easy for us to say, well, I don't understand why ordinary German people allowed that to happen. Okay, but living at the time, it was seen in a very, very different way. But let's not overstate it. Okay, we do need to understand there was negativity there as well, and all the way through. Okay, so we need to be able to just consider what the negativity was, some of the negatives that are there. So what are we saying? In a nutshell, Although most Germans consented to some extent to the Nazi regime at one time or other, we've done that, especially in the 1930s before the war, we've done that. Equally, most Germans had a reason to oppose the regime, and especially from the late 1930s onwards. Okay. So that begs the question then, if most Germans had a reason, what were those reasons? And why did they not oppose? Okay. And clearly the legal nature of the regime is an important factor, the fact that it was seen to be legal. Okay. And also fear of the consequences of opposition. And when we say opposition, that means just even speaking out or even making a joke about Hitler actually made it very difficult to be active in opposing Hitler. If you actually felt you wanted to make your voice heard, it was very, very difficult. So that's in a nutshell. Develop this a little bit more. Okay. So this is our final slide. So just got a little bit more information here for you on this. 5 points. The first point. So many Germans saw through the Führer cult. Okay, we've obviously talked about this idea of Hitler as a heroic person who almost like was the successor of great Germans like Bismarck, a man of heroic personal qualities who had become the voice of the people. Now, although many Germans were, in a sense, hoodwinked by that propaganda message, many Germans saw through it. Okay, we know that. We know that from personal diaries and letters that historians have since had access to. It didn't get through to everybody. So many Germans were not swept along. It was a complex picture. Okay. So when we look at those Germans who were not swept along, we ask, well, why didn't they oppose Hitler? Why, when it became obvious that that their leader was a gangster and a man intent on war and all those sorts of things that we now know, if some Germans cut through all of the Goebbels propaganda and they saw at heart what Hitler was about, why did they not? What prevented them from opposing Hitler? There were too many constraints. So what were the constraints? Well, that's why, in a sense, the legal revolution was so important. Okay, that Hitler's takeover of power in 1933 to 4 was not just a revolution, it was a legal revolution. At every step, Hitler was determined to present, to dress it up as being within the Constitution, within the terms of the Constitution. Okay, so the Reichstag fire decree was backed up by Article 48 of the Constitution. So the suspension of civil liberties, for example, that the Reichstag power decree gave to Hitler was constitutional because Article 48, which said that the head of government in a time of emergency could get a law passed by going straight to the president and not going to the Reichstag, which is what Hitler did on the 28th of February 1933, that was constitutional. It was written into the Constitution by Hugo Preuss in 1919, that Article 48, that in a time of emergency, that a chancellor had the right to do that. Similarly, the Enabling Act was constitutional because it was written into the Weimar Constitution, Article 76, that the Constitution could be changed by a 2/3 majority vote in the Reichstag. Hitler was at great pains to do that. He didn't need to do it. He could have simply just made it happen. But then, in a sense, he would have been at war with his own people. And Hitler wanted to convince his own people that he was a man who respected law and order. Okay, and that's the important thing. Okay, Germany became a one-party state. He backed it up with the law against the new formation of parties, the 14th of July 1933. So there's no possibility of voting for an established opposition party anymore. People didn't complain because they saw it as being legal. Okay, that legal revolution of 1933 were all made to appear to be constitutional. And if you're kind of like, in particular, the middle classes, and they were the main backers of Hitler, now many of them genuinely backed Hitler into power in 1933 because they saw him as a man who would do good. And many middle classes, of course, continued to back Hitler, but over time, the eyes were open to many of these middle class backers of Hitler were not bad people. They didn't want war. War's not good for business if you're a middle class person. They didn't want war, and they all, or many middle classes, changed their mind about Hitler over the course of the first 4 or 5 years of Hitler's rule. But very few middle classes chose to speak out against Hitler because, in a sense, Hitler had dressed it up as being legal. And again, your middle class German person is a big, deep respecter of law and order. After all, many middle classes are professionals. They're educated. They run businesses. The whole basis of your livelihood and who you are is based on the fundamental importance of you must respect law and order. Because if you don't respect law and order, then we've got chaos. Chaos isn't good for business, etc., etc. So, by implication, because Hitler was able to dress everything up as being legal, it made opposition very difficult for them, because we're breaking the law if we oppose Hitler. Okay, Hitler got to power legally, therefore we've got to do as we've been told. We made this happen, so we've got to respect the law that has come out of it. So it was ultimately a safety valve that stopped Germans speaking out against Hitler. That was an important factor. So as a result, if Germans, in spite of all that, if Germans did dare to speak out, finally, and some Germans put all that to one side and said, in spite of the legality, I actually know that the legal revolution was really not following the spirit of the Constitution, and that everything that's happened was fundamentally wrong, okay, and therefore I will speak out against him. It was very, very difficult for Germans to speak out, because by the time they began to see Hitler for what he was, say by about 1935-36, by that point, these people, the SS, Himmler, Heydrich, they're the leaders of the SS, the dreaded SS, they had taken over the German police force. The concentration camp apparatus had been set up, and the powers that Hitler had got to arrest people without trial had become well established and made efficient. Okay, there was a whole network of informers, and the secret police, which was that section of the German police called the Gestapo. Okay, the Gestapo were a subsection of the SS that ran the German police. They were the secret police, the Gestapo. Although they were not a massive organisation, they had networks of informers, party block wardens, etc., who kept an eye on the population. And so it was very dangerous even to crack a joke against Hitler. So if you were an ordinary German and you did have doubts in your head, and there would have been literally millions of ordinary Germans who had doubts in their head by 1936, the problem is it was too dangerous to say anything because of the risk of arrest. And if you can't say anything, and in fact it was better to go around pretending you liked Hitler by doing the Heil Hitler salute. So there were lots of people going around openly, publicly professing to be supporters of Hitler. In fact, probably many of them were not. But if you're there in the midst and you're looking to somehow oppose Hitler, you can't do it by yourself. You need to identify other people like yourself to form an opposition network. But who are these people? It was very, very difficult. In a sense, you were what we call atomized. It was like Hitler broke all the millions of German people up into little separate atoms, and each person by themselves was trapped in their own little prison. Yeah, and that was, they had to publicly behave in a certain way that they supported Hitler, and so it was very, very difficult for people to work together. Again, lots and lots of books on that. I mean, that sort of notion of what I've just said, atomization, that's inside the Noakes and Pridham chapters, the regime and the people. That's all explored there. Atomization. There's a whole section in that chapter about atomization. Okay, so any kind of behaviour, any criticism of Hitler was basically just defined as being a traitor, because if Hitler represented Germany and you criticised Hitler, you were weakening the nation. So it was very difficult. So there was definitely fear that underpinned it, although, and it's a complex picture, okay, that the same person could be motivated partly by fear of the regime, but also by admiration of Hitler and his achievements. And of course, that picture changed over time as well. It was very fluid as well. Okay. Nice little quote from Lee. Terror worked well because it affected only a minority, but at the same time deterred the majority from speaking out over issues that did not immediately affect them. Okay. So again, read that. Go to the Stephen J. Lee first essay in chapter 6, and it's very, very good as well. It's sort of like talking about these sorts of issues. That's it. That's the end of this lesson. Our third lesson then, we'll drill into some of the details about particular social groups, okay, middle classes, working classes, but also other groups such as by gender, women, young people. Again, we'll talk about the army and the military, those sorts of things, and that will be our next lesson. Thank you very much. Obviously, any queries, as always, you can message me, send a chat message in Microsoft Teams. I'm here for you to talk to, in spite of the fact that we're not face-to-face in this period of lockdown. Thank you very much. Bye.